The applause began at the far end of the long table where the wine had flowed most freely, and it spread like a slow wave through the candlelit dining hall of Keldmere until every glass was raised and every face was smiling. Every face except hers. Saren Ashford sat perfectly still in her chair, 3 seats from the foot of the table, her fingers pressed together beneath the white tablecloth where no one could see them trembling. She had known this moment was coming. Her mother had told her that morning, her voice clipped and matter-of-fact, as though she were announcing a change in the dinner menu rather than the destruction of her eldest daughter's life. And still, hearing the words spoken aloud in this grand room, before these 60 distinguished guests, was something else entirely. It was a blade she had braced for that cut deeper than she had imagined possible. The Duke of Dunhallow stood at the head of the table, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark evening coat sharpening the severity of his frame. His face, always striking, always solemn, held an expression she could not read. It was not joy. It was not triumph. It was the face of a man fulfilling an obligation, and that somehow made it worse. He extended his hand to the young woman seated at his right, and Ottilie rose, with a grace that seemed almost practiced, her cheeks flushed a perfect pink, her golden curls catching the candlelight. "It is my honor," the Duke said, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "to present Miss Ottilie Ashford, who has consented to become my wife and the future Duchess of Dunhallow." The room erupted. Congratulations poured forth from every quarter. Ladies pressed gloved hands to their hearts. Gentlemen raised their glasses higher. Saren's mother, seated midway along the table in a gown of midnight blue, allowed herself a small, controlled smile. It was the smile of a woman watching a 7-year campaign reach its culmination. 7 years. The number pulsed behind Saren's eyes like a wound reopened with each beat of her heart. 7 years since Emmerich Vane had stood in the garden at Briarwood, her family's home, and taken both her hands in his. 7 years since he had looked at her with those dark, searching eyes and spoken the words she had carried like a flame through every cold and lonely night that followed. "Wait for me," he had said, his voice rough with the weight of what he was asking. "I will come back to you, Saren. I swear it." She had waited. Through the first winter, when the letters came regularly, thick with his handwriting, full of the places he had seen and the things he endured, and always, always ending with her name. Through the second year, when the letters grew less frequent. Through the third, when they stopped altogether. Through the fourth and fifth, when the absence of his words became its own landscape, vast and featureless and impossible to cross. Through the sixth, when her father died and the world she knew collapsed around her. Through the seventh, when her mother announced that the Duke had written, not to Saren, but to Ottilie. She had waited, and this was her answer. Her younger sister's hand in his, her younger sister's name on his lips. A room full of strangers, applauding the erasure of everything she had been promised. Saren did not cry. She had made a decision about that long ago, in the terrible months after the letter stopped. She had decided that her pain would remain her own. She would not display it for the consumption of others. She would not give anyone the satisfaction of watching her break. So she sat, and she offered a small, careful expression, calibrated to convey nothing more than polite acknowledgement. She lifted her glass when the toast was called. Though the wine never touched her lips, she met no one's eyes. She looked at a point just above her sister's golden head, at the portrait of some long-dead Vane ancestor on the far wall, and she held herself together with the same ferocious discipline that had carried her through the years of waiting. Across the table, old Lady Hargreaves leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind her fan. Saren did not need to hear the words. She could read them in the pitying glance that followed. The comparison was being made. It was always being made. Ottilie, golden and vivacious and 21. Saren, dark-haired and still and 27. The one who had been chosen, and the one who had been passed over. She became aware of her mother watching her from across the table. Cosima Ashford's gaze was steady, assessing, and beneath its surface warmth lay something harder. A warning. Do not make a scene. Do not embarrass this family. Do not ruin what I have built. Saren held her mother's gaze for precisely 1 second, then looked away. The dinner continued. Courses came and went. She was aware, with every nerve in her body, of the Duke at the far end of the table. She did not look at him directly. She did not need to. She could feel his presence the way one feels. A shift in weather, a heaviness that precedes a storm. Once, just once, she allowed her gaze to drift in his direction. He was listening to something Audley was saying, his head inclined slightly toward her. But his eyes were not on Audley. They were fixed on the tablecloth in front of him, dark and distant. And then, as if feeling the weight of her attention, he looked up. Their eyes met across the length of the candlelit table, across the chasm of 7 years, and everything that had been lost between them. It lasted no more than a heartbeat. His expression did not change. There was no flicker of recognition, no ghost of what they had once been to each other. He looked at her the way one looks at a stranger who has accidentally caught one's eye in a crowded room, with nothing. Then he turned back to Audley, and the moment was gone. Saren set down her fork. Her hand was steady, but something inside her, the last small, stubborn flame she had carried through every year of waiting, the belief that there had been a reason, that the absence had an explanation, that he had not simply forgotten, flickered and nearly died. Nearly, but not quite, because even as the pain threatened to swallow her whole, a question surfaced. A question that had been growing in the back of her mind for months, fed by small inconsistencies and half-caught glances and a single conversation she had overheard between her mother and Audley, that had stopped the moment she entered the room. If the Duke had truly stopped caring for her, if he had chosen Audley freely and without reservation, then why had her mother worked so hard to ensure that Saren never had a single moment alone with him since his return? The child appeared on the 3rd day. The Ashford family had been installed in the east wing of Keldmere Hall, a suite of handsome rooms overlooking the lake, as befitted the family of the future Duchess. Saren had been given the smallest room, at the farthest end of the corridor. She did not complain. Distance from her mother and sister was not a punishment, it was a mercy. She was sitting by the window of the morning room, hemming a petticoat that needed mending, when she became aware of being watched. She looked up from her needlework and saw the child standing in the doorway. She was small for her age, whatever her age was, with cropped dark hair that looked as though it had been cut with shears rather than scissors, and enormous gray eyes that seemed to take up half her face. She wore a plain dress of good quality that did not quite fit her. She stood absolutely still, one hand resting on the doorframe, watching Saren with an expression that was neither friendly nor hostile. It was simply watchful, in the way a wild creature watches a human to determine whether they represent a threat. This was Wren. The household had made its judgment of her already. The maids called her the ghost child when they thought no one could hear. The cook said she gave her shivers the way she appeared and disappeared without making a sound. The Duke's steward, a practical man named Harsent, had tried and failed on multiple occasions to arrange governesses for her. Each attempt had been met with the same blank, immovable resistance. She did not speak. She did not cry. She did not play. She simply existed in the margins of the great house, a small, wordless presence that everyone noticed and no one knew how to reach. The Duke provided for her out of obligation. Captain Aldous Fenn had been his dearest friend, killed in a skirmish in the final months of the Duke's service abroad. The child had no other family. The Duke had taken her in, as honor demanded, but he was a man unaccustomed to children and consumed by his return to an estate that had changed profoundly in his absence. Wren was fed, clothed, housed, and utterly alone. Saren recognized that loneliness. It was a mirror of her own. She did not speak to the child in the doorway. She did not beckon her or smile or make any of the coaxing overtures that the governesses had tried and that had driven Wren further into her withdrawal. Saren simply returned to her needlework. She continued to sew, her movements slow and even, the needle rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She was aware of the child's eyes on her, and she let them rest there, without acknowledgement or demand. After a time, perhaps 5 minutes, perhaps 10, Wren moved. She did not enter the room. She sat down on the floor just inside the doorway, her back against the wall, her knees drawn up to her chest. She sat and watched Saren sew, and the stillness between them was not awkward or heavy. It was simply an absence of noise, the kind that settles when two people are comfortable enough not to fill it. When Saren finished her mending and rose to leave, the child was gone. The doorway was empty, as though she had never been there at all. The next morning, Saren found a small, smooth pebble placed carefully on the windowsill, exactly where she had been sitting. It was gray and perfectly round, polished by water. She picked it up and held it in her palm, feeling its cool weight. She did not know what it meant, but she understood that it was an offering, the first tentative gesture of a creature that had forgotten how to trust. She placed the pebble in the pocket of her dress, and she kept it there. The pattern established itself over the following days. Wherever Saren went in the house, Wren appeared. Not beside her, not underfoot, but nearby. In the corridor outside the room where Saren sat reading. At the far end of the garden where Saren walked in the mornings, the child never spoke. She never asked for anything. She simply attended, a small, serious shadow. The household noticed. The servants whispered about it with the same breathless fascination they had once reserved for the Duke's engagement. Cosima Ashford noticed too, and her reaction was not fascination but irritation. She mentioned it to Saren over breakfast on the 5th day, her voice light but edged. "You seem to have acquired a stray, Saren. I do hope you are not encouraging it. The Duke did not bring that child here to be your project." Saren set down her tea. "I have done nothing to encourage her." "Then see that you do not," her mother said, and returned to her toast. It was the same pattern Saren had known her entire life. Her mother, issuing commands that were shaped like advice, drawing lines that were meant to isolate, to control, to keep Saren small and contained and far from anything that might give her purpose or connection. But Wren was not a project. She was a lonely child in a house full of adults who did not know what to do with her. And Saren, who had spent years learning the particular geography of loneliness, could not bring herself to turn away, even if it cost her. Her name was Saren Ashford, the overlooked elder sister, the woman who had waited and been quietly replaced. That was the story the world saw, and it was the story her mother had carefully written. But beneath it lay another, and it had begun to surface in the weeks before the engagement was announced, in fragments and whispers, like a document written in invisible ink that only became legible when held to the flame. The letters. Everything came back to the letters. For the first 2 years of the Duke's absence, Saren had written faithfully. Every week, without fail, she had sat at the small writing desk in her room at Briarwood and poured herself onto the page. She wrote about the garden and the weather and the books she was reading, and between those ordinary lines she wove the things she could not say aloud, that she missed him, that the house felt too large without the promise of his return, anchoring her days, that she was keeping his world intact for him, visiting his tenants when she could, maintaining the fragile web of connections between their families, so that when he came back, everything would be as he had left it. His replies had come at first, warm and steady and laced with the same longing that filled her own. He wrote about the regiment and the heat and the strangeness of foreign skies, and he always ended with her name. Then the letter stopped. She had written 3 more times, each letter more desperate than the last, before a final message arrived. It was brief and formal, devoid of warmth. It thanked her for her correspondence and expressed the hope that she would find happiness elsewhere. It wished her well. It was written on his stationery, in his own hand, and it had broken her. She had not questioned it. That was the cruelest part, looking back. She had been so conditioned by her mother's persistent undermining, so accustomed to believing that good things were not meant for her, that she had accepted the rejection as inevitable. Of course he had forgotten her. Of course a duke would not wait for the plain elder daughter of a declining country family when the world was full of women more beautiful, more charming, more suited to his station. She had grieved, and she had let go, or she had tried to. Then her father died, and the fragile architecture of her life collapsed entirely. The debts were larger than anyone had known. Briarwood was mortgaged. Cosima, suddenly and spectacularly widowed, had seized control of the family's affairs with a ruthlessness that startled even those who knew her well. She had sold what could be sold, dismissed the remaining servants, and begun a campaign of correspondence with every family of influence within 50 miles. It was during this period of upheaval that Saren had found the first fracture in her mother's careful construction. She had been sorting through her father's study, boxing his papers for storage, when she found a drawer that had been locked. The key was on her father's ring, which Cosima had overlooked in her haste to secure the valuables. Inside the drawer were letters, not many. 3 addressed to Saren in a hand she did not recognize, bearing a military postal mark. They had been opened, read, and placed in the locked drawer. They were not from the Duke. They were from Captain Aldous Fenn, the Duke's closest friend in the regiment. The first was a brief, friendly note introducing himself and expressing the Duke's warm regards. The second was more urgent. It mentioned that the Duke was concerned because he had not received any letters from Saren in over a year. "He is writing still," Fenn had written, "though he fears his letters are not reaching you. He asked me to try a different route." The third letter was the most alarming. It was dated nearly 2 years before her father's death. "I must be frank with you, Miss Ashford. The Duke believes you have ended your understanding with him. He received a letter, purportedly from you, expressing this wish. He is devastated. I do not know what has transpired on your side, but something is very wrong." Saren had sat on the floor of her father's study, the letters in her lap, and felt the ground shift beneath her. Someone had written to the Duke in her name, ending their understanding. Someone had intercepted his letters to her, and hers to him. Someone had locked Captain Fenn's warnings in a drawer where they would never be found. And the cold, final letter she had received from the Duke, the one that had broken her, had not been a rejection at all, it had been a response. He had written it, believing she had already ended things, because someone had told him so in her name. She had looked up from the letters and seen her own reflection in the darkened window of the study. Behind her reflection, the shadowy outline of the hallway, and standing in that hallway half-turned as if she had been passing and paused, her mother. Their eyes met in the glass. Cosima's expression did not change. She held her daughter's gaze for one long, terrible moment. Then she continued walking, her footsteps measured and unhurried, disappearing into the darkness of the house. Neither of them spoke of it, but Saren understood. The careful architecture of her loneliness, the years without word from him, the letter that had broken her heart, all of it had been constructed, deliberately and patiently, by the woman who had given her life. She did not yet have proof that could be shown to a court or spoken aloud in a room full of witnesses. Captain Fenn's letters were suggestive, but not conclusive. The forged letter to the Duke, the one ending their understanding in her name, was not in her possession. She had only the shape of the lie, not its substance, but she knew. And now she was living under the same roof as the man who had been deceived alongside her, watching her sister perform a courtship built on the wreckage of her own. And she could not speak. Not yet. Not without proof that would be impossible to deny. Because her mother was clever, far cleverer than anyone gave her credit for. Cosima Ashford would deny everything, weep beautifully, and cast Saren as a jealous, unstable spinster grasping at fantasies. The world would believe her. The world always believed a beautiful woman's tears over a still woman's truth. So Saren kept her counsel. She wore her self-command like armor. She carried Captain Fenn's 3 letters sewn into the lining of her traveling case, the only evidence she possessed, and she watched. She watched her mother charm the Duke's household. She watched Audley bloom under the attention of a man who had once promised to love another. She watched the Duke's dark, guarded eyes and searched them for any trace of what they had once held for her, and she waited. Again, but this time, she was not waiting for a letter or a promise or a man to come back to her. She was waiting for the moment to act, and she was terrified, not of failing, but of what she would become if she succeeded. Because the truth, when it finally came to light, would not just expose her mother. It would shatter her sister's happiness, destroy her family's last shred of standing, and force the Duke to confront a betrayal so intimate and so cruel that it might break whatever remained of the man she had once loved. The truth was a weapon, and Saren was not yet certain she had the courage to use it. The engagement celebrations were to last a full fortnight. Cosima had ensured this. She had suggested it to the Duke's elderly aunt, Lady Fairholme, who served as the nominal hostess of Keldmere in the absence of a Duchess, and Lady Fairholme, delighted to have the house full of life again, had readily agreed. Cosima had positioned herself at the center of every arrangement, and she had assigned Saren a role in the proceedings that was as deliberate as it was cruel. Saren was to assist Audley. Not as a sister, not as an equal, but as something closer to a lady's maid. She was to help with Audley's wardrobe, her correspondence, her hair. She was to sit beside her during the morning calls from local families and pour the tea while Audley received their congratulations. It was a performance designed for an audience, and its message was unmistakable. Saren's place was behind her sister, in service to her sister's happiness, and she would enact that submission publicly, gracefully, without complaint. "It will be good for you," Cosima had said, adjusting a brooch at her collar with studied casualness. "It shows the world you bear no ill will. People are watching, Saren. People were indeed watching." The sidelong glances of the guests, the pitying whispers of the older women, the frank curiosity of the younger ones, they all wanted to see how she carried this particular burden. She gave them nothing. She pinned Audley's hair and told her she looked beautiful, because she did. She poured the tea and smiled a careful, neutral smile she had perfected. She performed the role her mother had written for her, and she performed it flawlessly. But it cost her. Every morning, standing behind Audley at the mirror, she felt the weight of the lost years pressing on her shoulders. Every evening, watching her sister descend the staircase on the Duke's arm, she felt the flame inside her gutter and fight for air. She held on because she had to. The proof she needed was somewhere in this house. She could not afford to be dismissed, sent away, removed from the only place where the truth might still be found. Wren complicated everything. The child had not stopped her attendance. Despite Cosima's warning, despite Saren's careful efforts not to seek her out, Wren appeared. She appeared in the corridor outside the morning room. She appeared at the edge of the garden. She appeared most dangerously in the drawing room during one of Audley's morning receptions, sitting in a window seat with her knees drawn up, her gray eyes tracking Saren's every movement. Cosima saw it. Her displeasure was immediate. "The child is here again," she murmured to Saren, her voice barely audible beneath the chatter of the guests. "Remove her!" Saren crossed the room to the window seat. Wren looked up at her, those enormous eyes holding a question that the child's voice would not ask. Saren felt the pull in her chest, the aching recognition of a soul that had nowhere else to turn. Instead, she leaned down and spoke softly. "You must go now. This room is not for us." She had said "us" without thinking. The word hung in the air between them, small and true. Wren looked at her for a long moment. Then she unfolded herself from the window seat and slipped from the room without a sound, a small dark figure disappearing through the bright chattering crowd. Like a leaf carried away on a current, Seren did not know that the Duke had entered the drawing room from the opposite door just in time to see the exchange. She did not know that he had watched her cross the room, bend to the child, and speak words he could not hear. She did not know that he had seen Ren's face as the child left, the brief, startled softness in those guarded eyes, and Seren's own expression as she turned away, a look of such carefully contained sorrow that it stopped him in the doorway. He had not spoken to the child that morning. He rarely did. His obligation to Ren was financial and administrative, discharged through Harsant and a succession of failed governesses. He told himself that this was sufficient. But watching Seren send the child away, watching the gentleness in her posture and the pain in her compliance, he felt something he could not name. Not guilt, something before guilt, a premonition of it. A sense that something was happening in his house that he was failing to see clearly. He watched Seren resume her place behind her sister's chair. He watched her pour tea and smile and efface herself, and he thought of a word he had not considered in connection with anyone in a very long time: dignity. The first week of the engagement festivities passed, and Cosima tightened her grip. It was done so skillfully that no one who was not looking for it would have noticed. The room assignments were adjusted. Seren was moved from her already modest chamber to a smaller one on the floor above, ostensibly because a visiting family required additional space. The new room was directly above the nursery where Ren slept, and far from the main corridors where the family gathered. Her duties expanded. In addition to attending Ottilie, Seren was now expected to manage the floral arrangements for each evening's dinner, to sort and catalog the wedding gifts that had begun arriving, and to assist Lady Fairholme with her correspondence. These tasks consumed every hour of Seren's day from morning until well past dark, leaving her no time to think, no time to search, and no time to be anywhere near the Duke. Cosima understood instinctively that her eldest daughter was dangerous when left alone, when given time to observe and piece together the inconsistencies. So she ensured that Seren was never alone and never still. The isolation deepened in subtler ways. Cosima began to include small, seemingly innocent remarks in conversation when others could hear. Little observations about Seren's temperament, her difficulty adjusting to social life after so many years of retirement in the country. "She has always preferred her own company," Cosima would say with a fond, regretful smile. Even as a child, she was a solitary creature. We worried, of course, but some natures simply cannot be changed. The effect was masterful. Without ever saying a word against her daughter, Cosima was constructing a portrait of Seren as fragile, eccentric, and faintly pitiable. A woman whose observations and accusations, should she ever dare to make them, could be dismissed as the products of an unhappy and disordered mind. Seren recognized the strategy. She had watched her mother deploy it against others over the years, against her father's sister who had questioned the household accounts, against a neighbor who had disputed a boundary line. Cosima did not attack directly. She eroded. She undermined the ground beneath her opponent's feet so gradually that by the time the collapse came, it looked like the victim had simply lost her footing. Seren lay awake in her narrow bed in the room above the nursery, staring at the ceiling in the thin moonlight, and felt the walls of her situation closing in. The proof was somewhere. The forged letter, the intercepted correspondence. It had to exist. Cosima was too meticulous, too vain in her own cleverness, to have destroyed everything. She would have kept something, a trophy, an insurance policy. But where? Cosima's rooms were locked. Her writing case traveled with her and was never left unattended. Her trunk was fitted with a brass lock, for which only she had the key, and in the stillness of the house she heard it. A small sound from the floor below. A whimper high and thin, the sound of a child crying in her sleep. Ren. Seren pressed her hand against the floorboards as though she could send comfort through the wood and stone. Two lonely creatures, separated by a floor and by the rules of a house that neither of them had made. She could not help Ren. She could not help herself. She could only endure and watch and wait for the single mistake that her mother would eventually make, 'cause everyone made mistakes. Even Cosima Ashford. Lady Fairholme was 83 years old and largely confined to her favorite armchair in the west drawing room, but her mind was as clear and cutting as a January frost. She had been the Duke's father's elder sister, and she had lived at Keldmere for the better part of 6 decades, watching the house and its inhabitants with the detached amusement of a woman who had outlived most of her enemies and all of her patience for pretense. She had taken note of Saran Ashford from the very first evening, not because of the engagement drama. What had caught her attention was the quality of Saran's stillness. It was not the stillness of a defeated woman. It was the stillness of someone who was thinking very hard and very carefully. And Lady Fairholme, who had spent her long life surrounded by people who talked a great deal and thought very little, found this rare and compelling. She had also noticed the child. She watched Ran trail Saran through the corridors, and she watched Saran's face each time the child was near, the softening around the eyes, the instinctive lean toward the small figure as though drawn by gravity. And she had watched Cosima Ashford. She had known women like Cosima before, charming, capable, immaculately presented, and absolutely ruthless. Lady Fairholme had said nothing for 10 days. She preferred to observe before she acted. But on the morning of the 11th day, she summoned Saran to help her sort a box of old letters. When Saran arrived, she found Lady Fairholme alone, the box unopened on the table, and a pot of tea for 2 set on the low table before the fire. "Sit down, child," Lady Fairholme said, and closed the door. Saran obeyed. "You may stop arranging your face," the old woman said dryly. "I am too old to be fooled and too tired to bother being tactful. I have been watching you for the better part of a fortnight, and I have 3 observations. The first is that you are not what your mother says you are. The second is that the child upstairs knows this. And the third is that my nephew is a blind fool, which is a hereditary condition in this family, and one for which I have very little sympathy." Saran's self-command, maintained so carefully for so many days, wavered. Her lips parted, but no words came. Lady Fairholme poured the tea. "Your mother is a formidable woman. She has this household completely deceived. Everyone sees a gracious mother sacrificing for the happiness of her younger daughter. I see something quite different. I see a woman who has placed one daughter on a throne and the other on a shelf, and I would very much like to know why." "My mother has her reasons," Saran said. "Reasons and truths are not the same thing, are they?" Saran felt the prick of tears and fought them back. She had not cried in years. She would not start now. "I notice you did not answer," Lady Fairholme said. "A guilty woman denies. An innocent woman with nothing to hide explains. A woman who is protecting something simply goes still." She set down the teapot. "What are you protecting, Miss Ashford?" "I am protecting the only thing I have left," Saran said at last. "The truth." Lady Fairholme regarded her steadily. "Then you had better protect it well, because your mother is working very hard to ensure that no one will believe it. When it comes to light," she picked up her teacup, "I have seen this before. A strong woman made to look weak. A truthful woman made to look unreliable. It works because the world prefers a comfortable lie to an inconvenient truth." She took a slow sip. I do not yet know what has happened between you and my nephew, but I know the smell of injustice, Miss Ashford. I have lived in this house for 60 years, and I have learned to tell the difference between a woman who is lost and a woman who has been robbed." She set down her cup and fixed Saran with a gaze that was suddenly hard. "The child sees you. I see you. And sooner or later, my nephew will see you too. Though I confess the men in this family have always been spectacularly slow in these matters." For the first time in weeks, something loosened in Saran's chest. Not hope. Something before hope, the knowledge that she was not entirely alone. "I cannot ask for your help," Saren said. "You did not ask," Lady Fairholme replied. "I offered. There is a difference, and at my age, the difference matters." She gestured to the box of letters. "Now we had better sort these, or your mother will wonder what we have been discussing. And Miss Ashford," Saren looked up, "the child, Wren, do not send her away again. Whatever your mother says, do not turn away a creature that has come to you for shelter. It is bad for the soul, yours and hers." Saren left 20 minutes later, the box of sorted letters in her arms. But the pebble in her pocket felt warmer now, and the corridor, for the first time since she had arrived at Keldmere, did not feel quite so long. Behind her, Lady Fairholme reached for the small brass bell beside her chair and rang it once. When the footman appeared, she gave a single instruction. "Ask the Duke to come and see me before dinner. Tell him his aunt has something to discuss regarding the household. Tell him it is not a request." The conversation with Lady Fairholme changed the balance, not outwardly, not in any way Cosima could detect, but within Saren herself. She was no longer carrying the weight entirely alone. Someone had looked at her and seen not the portrait her mother had painted, but the woman underneath. She needed the proof. That had not changed. Captain Fenn's 3 letters were suggestive but not conclusive. They proved that someone had interfered with the correspondence. They did not prove who. Without the forged letter that had been sent to the Duke in her name, Cosima would deny everything. The forged letter was the key. If it still existed, the Duke would have it. It would be among his personal papers, perhaps kept in the way people keep the instruments of their deepest hurts, not because they want to remember, but because they cannot bring themselves to destroy the evidence that they were once that vulnerable. Saren needed access to the Duke's study. This was the room adjacent to the library, a smaller, more private chamber where the Duke conducted his personal correspondence. The door was kept locked when he was not present, and he spent most of his mornings there. She studied his movements for 3 days. He rose early, rode out to inspect the farms, returned by 10, and closeted himself in the study until the midday meal. There was a narrow window of time. Each morning, between his return from the ride and his arrival in the study, he went to his dressing room to change. This took between 15 and 20 minutes. During this time, the study was empty, but the door was locked. It was Wren who provided the answer, though the child did not know it. On the morning of the 12th day, Saren was crossing the entrance hall when she saw Wren emerge from a narrow door set into the paneling beneath the main staircase, small enough to be mistaken for a cupboard. Wren closed it behind her with the practiced ease of someone who had used it many times, glanced around, and disappeared toward the kitchens. Saren crossed the hall and opened it. Behind it was a passage, narrow, unlit, and smelling faintly of plaster dust and old wood. It was a servant's passage, one of the hidden arteries that ran through the bones of old houses like Keldmere, allowing staff to move between rooms without being seen. She stepped inside and let her eyes adjust. The passage ran in both directions with branches splitting off at intervals. She moved toward a thin line of light beneath a door further along, counting her paces, orienting herself against the layout of the house. The entrance hall was behind her. The library would be to her right. And this door would open into the Duke's study. She pressed her ear to the wood. Nothing. She tried the handle. It was not locked from this side. The servant's door, designed for invisibility, operated on a simple latch. She eased the door open a crack and saw the study empty, lit by pale morning light. She could not go in now. The Duke could return at any moment, but she had a way in, and she knew the window of time when the room would be empty. Tomorrow morning she would have 15 minutes. She closed the door, retreated down the passage, and emerged into the entrance hall, with her pulse roaring in her ears and her face betraying nothing. She had her route. She had her window. She had one chance. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. She went in the following morning. The Duke left for his ride at 7, as he always did. Saren watched from her window as his tall figure crossed the stable yard in the gray dawn light, mounted the dark bay gelding, and rode out through the park gates. She dressed quickly, chose the plainest shoes she owned, and descended the back stairs. The house was stirring, but not yet awake. Saren crossed the entrance hall, opened the small door beneath the staircase, and slipped into the passage. The darkness swallowed her. She moved by touch and memory until she found the door. She listened. Nothing. She opened it and stepped into the Duke's study. The room was cold. The fire had not yet been laid. She went to the desk first. Her hands moved quickly but carefully, lifting papers, scanning their contents, replacing them in exactly the order she had found them. Estate correspondence, tenancy agreements, invitations. Nothing personal. Nothing from years ago. The cabinet. She crossed to it and tried the doors. They opened without resistance. Inside were shelves of bound ledgers, files of legal documents, and at the very back, a wooden box. It was not locked. She lifted the lid. Letters. Dozens of them, tied in bundles with plain cord. Her stomach lurched. She recognized the stationery. She recognized the ink. They were her letters, the ones she had written during the first 2 years, the weekly outpourings of love and longing and ordinary life that she had entrusted to the post and believed had reached him. They were here, every single one of them, opened, read, and kept. He had received them, he had read them, and he had kept them. And that single fact rearranged the landscape of the past so violently that she had to grip the edge of the cabinet to keep her balance. Beneath the bundles of her letters was a separate packet, thinner, tied with a darker cord. She untied it and found what she had come for, a single sheet of cream-colored paper, her mother's stationery, the kind Cosima ordered specially from a shop in Bath. The handwriting was a careful imitation of Saren's own, close enough to deceive someone who was not looking for the forgery. Different enough that Saren could see the discrepancies instantly, the slight leftward slant that was not hers. The way the capital letters were formed, with a loop, she never used. She read it. The words were precise and brutal. They expressed regret. They cited a change of feeling. They released the Duke from any understanding between them and wished him happiness in his future life. They were signed with her name, and reading them in her mother's imitation of her handwriting was like watching someone wear her own face to commit a crime. And now she understood the cold reply she had received from the Duke all those years ago. He had not rejected her. He had been responding to this. He had believed she had already ended things, because this letter told him so. His brief, formal reply had been the wounded response of a man who believed himself abandoned. 2 people destroyed by one forgery, each convinced the other had walked away. Beneath the forged letter was one final document. A note in a different hand, smaller and more hurried. It was from Cosima, but written as herself, not as Saren. It was addressed to the Duke and dated 3 months before his return to England. It expressed a mother's gentle concern for her daughter's welfare. It mentioned Saren's fragile state of mind, her tendency toward fanciful thinking. It suggested, with exquisite delicacy, that Ottilie, who was so much stronger and more resilient, might serve as a bridge between the families. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, laying the groundwork for everything that followed. Saren stood in the cold study, the letters in her hands, and felt the full devastating architecture of her mother's work. It was not a single act of cruelty. It was a campaign that had lasted years. The interception of letters, the forgery, the careful cultivation of the Duke's belief that Saren had abandoned him, the equally careful cultivation of Saren's belief that she had been forgotten. And then, when both victims were sufficiently broken, the introduction of Ottilie as the solution. The younger, brighter, uncomplicated daughter, a fresh page on which Cosima could write whatever story served her ambitions. Her hands were shaking. She needed to take these letters. They were her proof, but taking them meant the Duke would notice their absence. Suspicion would fall everywhere, and Cosima, whose instincts were preternaturally sharp, would know immediately what had happened. The confrontation would come before Saren was ready, on Cosima's terms rather than her own. She placed the letters back exactly as she had found them, her hands trembling with the effort of letting go of the proof she had spent so long seeking. She retied the cords. She closed the cabinet. She crossed back to the servant's door and slipped into the passage, pulling it shut behind her. She leaned against the wall in the darkness, breathing hard. She had found it. The evidence existed. It was real, and it was devastating, and it was 20 feet away behind a cabinet door, and then she heard the footsteps, not from the passage, from the study. The sound of a door opening, of boots on floorboards, of someone entering the room she had left only moments before. The Duke had returned early. She pressed herself against the wall, not breathing, her eyes squeezed shut. She heard him move across the room. She heard the scrape of his chair. Had she left everything exactly as she found it? Had the cabinet door been fully closed? She could not remember. The terror of it was absolute. She stayed motionless in the dark passage for what felt like an eternity. Then, one agonizing step at a time, she retreated and emerged, pale and shaking, into the light of the ordinary morning. She did not know that the Duke, seated at his desk, had noticed something. Not a disturbance. Not an object out of place, but a scent, faint, barely there, disappearing even as he registered it, lavender and clean linen. It was not the smell of the room, it was something else, something that stirred a memory so deeply buried he could not place it. He sat still for a long moment, his pen raised, his brow furrowed. Then he shook his head and began to write. But the scent stayed with him, and the memory it carried, though he could not yet name it, had begun its slow, insistent work. Cosima struck that evening. It was not aimed at Saren directly. It was aimed at Wren, which was worse. The occasion was dinner, a formal affair, with 20 guests. Saren was in her usual position far from the head of the table. Ottilie was radiant in cream silk. The Duke was attentive in his measured, dutiful way. Then Wren appeared. She came through the dining room door like a small ghost, barefoot, in her nightdress, her dark hair wild around her face. She had clearly had a nightmare. Her gray eyes were wide and glazed with the particular terror of a child who has woken in a dark room and cannot remember where she is or why the people she loved are gone. The table fell still. 20 pairs of eyes turned to the child in the doorway. The Duke rose from his chair, his face tight. Before he could speak, Cosima acted. "Oh, the poor little thing," she said, her voice pitched perfectly between sympathy and gentle authority. She rose from her own chair, the picture of maternal warmth, and crossed to the child with her arms outstretched. "Come now, darling. Let us get you back to bed." She reached for Wren's hand. The child recoiled. It was not a flinch. It was a violent, full-bodied recoil, the reaction of an animal that has been grabbed before and will not be grabbed again. She stumbled backward, hit the doorframe, and let out a sound, the first sound Saren had ever heard her make. It was not a word. It was a high, thin cry of pure distress. Cosima reached again. Wren bolted. She did not run to the door or the corridor. She ran into the dining room, past the startled guests, around the end of the long table, and straight to Saren. She climbed onto Saren's lap, buried her face in Saren's shoulder, and wrapped her thin arms around Saren's neck with a grip so desperate that it made Saren gasp. The child was trembling violently. Her heart, pressed against Saren's chest, was beating so fast it felt like a bird trapped behind her ribs. 20 guests stared. Ottilie's mouth hung open. The Duke stood frozen at the head of the table. And Cosima, her arms still outstretched, her performance of maternal warmth stranded in midair, looked at her eldest daughter holding the child and understood that something had shifted beyond her control. Saren did not think. She did not calculate or strategize. She simply held the child. Her arms came around the small, shaking body, and she held her the way she had not been held herself in years, with an unconditional tenderness that owed nothing to performance and everything to instinct. "It is all right," she murmured into the child's wild, dark hair. "You are safe. I am here." The room was absolutely still. Cosima recovered first. She returned to her seat with a graceful laugh. "Well, it seems the child has made her choice. Children are such singular creatures, are they not?" She said it with perfect ease, but Saren saw the fury beneath the surface. Ren's public rejection of Cosima and her equally public attachment to Saren had rewritten the scene in a way that no amount of charm could undo. Every guest at that table had seen it. The child, frightened and desperate, had run past one woman's outstretched arms and straight into another's. The Duke sat down slowly. He watched Saren hold the child, her dark head bent over the smaller dark head, her hand moving in slow circles on the child's back. He watched the trembling subside, the desperate grip loosen, the small body gradually relax. He watched Saren do what he had never managed to do, what the governesses had never managed, what no amount of money or obligation had achieved. She reached her. When the child had quieted, Saren rose carefully, Ren's arms still around her neck, and carried her from the room. She did not ask permission. She did not look at her mother. She did not look at the Duke. She simply left, a slim, dark-haired woman carrying a sleeping child through the candlelit doorway and into the darkened corridor beyond. The Duke was not listening as the dinner party attempted to resume. He was looking at the empty doorway through which Saren had carried the child, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has just been shown something he should have seen a long time ago. Sleep did not come for the Duke that night. He sat in the study long after the household had retired, the fire burning low, a glass of untouched brandy on the desk before him. The image of the child running to Saren played behind his eyes on a relentless loop. The small, desperate figure, the instinctive embrace. The murmured words he had barely heard across the length of the room, but that had cut through the noise and the candlelight with the clarity of a bell. "You are safe. I am here." He had failed the child. He knew this now with a certainty that left no room for the comfortable excuses he had built around himself. He had discharged his obligation to Aldous Fenn's orphaned daughter through money and administration and the hiring of strangers, and he had told himself it was enough because the alternative, opening himself to another human being's need, to the terrifying vulnerability of caring. Not after the letter. He stood and crossed to the cabinet. He opened it, reached to the back and took out the wooden box. Perhaps it was the scent from that morning, lavender and clean linen, a ghost of something he had tried to forget. Perhaps it was the way Saren had held the child, with a tenderness so raw and unguarded that it had pierced through every defense he had built over the hollow years. He untied the bundles of her letters, the old ones, the ones she had written when he was far away and the world was simpler. He read the first one, then the second, then the third. He read them all, sitting on the floor beside the cabinet like a man who no longer trusts his legs to hold him, and he let her voice, her real voice, the voice he had loved, fill the room. They were beautiful. They were ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. They were full of the garden at Briarwood, and the changing light on the Devon hills, and the books she was reading and the tenets she had visited on his behalf. They were full of love, not the dramatic kind, but the steady, sustaining kind that manifests in attention and consistency, and the faithful repetition of small daily acts. And then they stopped. And then the other letter came. The cold, formal letter that had ended everything. He picked it up and read it again. He had read it 100 times. But tonight, with Serene's real letters still warm in his hands, the forgery looked different. The handwriting which he had accepted without question because the pain of its contents had blinded him to everything else was not quite right. The slant was wrong. The capital letters had a loop that Saren's did not. He had spent the past hour reading her genuine hand, page after page of it, and now the discrepancy was glaring. How had he not seen it? Because he had not wanted to see it. because the letter had confirmed his worst fear, that he was not worth waiting for, that the remarkable woman who had promised to hold his world together had simply let it go. It was easier to believe he had been abandoned than to consider the alternative, that the abandonment was a lie. He set the forged letter down and picked up Cosima's note, the one suggesting Ottilie as a more suitable match. He read it with new eyes, and the delicacy of its manipulation, the precise calibration of its lies, made his stomach turn. He stood and began to pace. His mind, trained by years of military service to analyze problems methodically, was assembling the pieces with a cold, relentless logic. The intercepted letters, the forgery, the carefully timed introduction of Ottilie, the systematic isolation of Saren within his own household, the portrait of fragility and eccentricity that Cosima had been painting since the day she arrived, and the scent, lavender and linen. Saren had been in this room. She had been standing where he stood, and she had been looking for exactly what he now held in his hands. She knew. She had come to Keldmere, not as a dutiful sister, but as a woman seeking proof of her own destruction. The courage of it staggered him. She had walked into a house controlled by the woman who had ruined her, submitted to indignities that would have broken a lesser spirit, and endured it all because she understood that the truth without proof is just another story, and stories can be denied. He gathered the letters, all of them. He placed them back in the box. Then he carried the box to his desk and locked it in the deepest drawer. He would not confront Cosima, not yet, not in anger. Anger was her territory. She would twist it, redirect it, use it against him. He needed to be precise. He needed to be just. He thought of Saren's face, the self-command that never broke, the dignity that had endured years of engineered heartbreak. The way she had held the child, the way her voice had carried across the dining room with absolute, unshakable certainty. "You are safe. I am here." He understood now. Those words were not just for Wren. They were the words Serene herself had been waiting to hear. From someone, from anyone, from him. He had failed her once. He would not fail her again. He summoned Lady Fairholme the following morning. The old woman arrived in the study with the unhurried deliberation of someone who had been expecting the call. She settled into the chair across from his desk, arranged her shawl, and looked at him with those sharp, knowing eyes.
"You have finally looked in the box,"
she said. It was not a question. The Duke stared at her. "You knew. I suspected. I have watched that girl for a fortnight, Emmerich. I have watched her mother for longer. One does not need to read the letters to see the shape of the crime. It is written on their faces, the guilt on one and the grief on the other. Why did you not tell me? Because you would not have believed me. You needed to see it for yourself. You needed to read her words and feel her absence and understand what was taken from you, from both of you." She paused, and from that child, the Duke was still for a long moment. "I have been a fool," he said, his voice rough. "Yes," Lady Fairholme agreed, without softening. "But you are not irredeemable. The question is what you intend to do about it. I intend to end this, today, not in anger, no, in justice." Lady Fairholme studied him. "How will you do it?" "I will gather them in the drawing room, all of them, Saren, Ottilie, and Cosima, and I will lay out the evidence and let the truth speak for itself." "Ottilie knows nothing," Lady Fairholme said. "Remember that. She is a pawn, not a conspirator. She is your fiancée, and she believes herself loved. What you are about to do will shatter her world." The Duke's jaw tightened. "I know. I will not be cruel, but I will not protect a lie to spare a feeling. That is what Cosima would do." Lady Fairholme nodded slowly. "Then I will be there, for both girls." The summons came at 4 o'clock. A footman delivered identical messages to Cosima's room, to Ottilie's, and to the small chamber above the nursery where Saren sat reading to Wren. The Duke requested the pleasure of the Ashford family's company in the west drawing room at their earliest convenience. Cosima arrived first, immaculate in dove gray, her expression pleasant and expectant. She assumed this was about the ball. She took a chair near the fire and crossed her ankles. Ottilie came next, bright-eyed and smiling, her arm linked through the footman's as though arriving at a party. She settled on the settee and looked around for the Duke with the easy confidence of a woman who believed herself at the center of a love story. Saren entered last. She was pale. She had felt the weight of the summons the moment she read it and had known, with the instinct of someone who has lived too long in fear, that something was about to change irrevocably. Wren had followed her to the corridor and stood outside the drawing-room door, a small sentinel who would not be moved. The Duke stood by the window, his back to the room. On the table beside him was the wooden box. Lady Fairholme sat in her customary chair in the corner. When the door closed, the Duke turned. He looked at the three women seated before him. His face was pale, but controlled. His dark eyes held a severity that Saren had never seen, a look that was not anger, but something older and harder, the look of a man about to deliver a verdict. I have asked you here because there is a matter of truth that must be addressed before this household takes another step forward. It concerns the circumstances of my engagement to Miss Ottilie Ashford and the events of the past 7 years. Cosima's pleasant expression did not waver, but something behind her eyes shifted, a flicker of alertness. She was already calculating. Ottilie looked confused. Emeric, what is this about? The Duke did not answer her directly. He opened the wooden box and removed the bundle of Saren's letters. He held them up so that all three women could see them. 7 years ago, I left England with an understanding. I had asked Miss Saren Ashford to wait for me, and she had agreed. For 2 years she wrote to me, faithfully, consistently, without fail. I received her letters and I kept them. Every one. He set the bundle down. Then they stopped. He picked up the forged letter. In their place, I received this, a letter bearing Saren's name in what I believed to be her hand, ending our understanding and releasing me from any obligation. I was devastated. I accepted it. I did not question it. He paused. I should have questioned it. Cosima's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. Emeric, I do not understand the purpose of this. You will. He held the forged letter beside one of Saren's genuine letters. The handwriting is close, but not identical. The slant is wrong. The letter formations are different. It is a careful forgery, but it is a forgery. This letter was not written by Saren. The room went very still. Ottilie's face had drained of color. She looked from the Duke to her sister to her mother. I do not understand, she whispered. I did not understand either, the Duke said. Not until I found this. He held up Cosima's note, the one laying the groundwork for Ottilie's introduction. A letter from Mrs. Ashford to me, written 3 months before my return. It expresses concern for Serene's mental state. It suggests that my return might cause her distress. It recommends Ottilie as a more suitable match. It is, in effect, a proposal to replace one daughter with another, and it was written by the same woman who forged a letter, ending my understanding with her elder daughter. Every eye in the room turned to Cosima. She did not crumble. Saren had known she would not. Cosima Ashford was not a woman who crumbled. She drew herself up in her chair, her face hardening into a mask of wounded dignity. This is outrageous. You are accusing me of fabricating letters? Of manipulating my own children? On what evidence? A similarity in handwriting, on the evidence of Captain Aldous Fenn, the Duke said. Cosima's poise cracked. It was a hairline fracture, visible only to those who were watching closely, but it was there. The name had landed like a stone in still water. Captain Fenn wrote to Saren 3 times, the Duke continued. He wrote because I asked him to, because I was desperate, because I could not understand why the woman I loved had stopped writing. His letters were intercepted, opened, and hidden in a locked drawer in Saren's father's study, where she found them after his death. He paused. Captain Fenn is dead now. He died serving alongside me. He cannot testify to what he wrote. But his letters survive, and they tell a very clear story. Someone intercepted correspondence in both directions. Someone ensured that Saren believed she had been forgotten, and that I believed she had moved on. Someone spent years engineering a separation for the purpose of replacing one daughter with another. He looked directly at Cosima, and his voice dropped to a register that was almost gentle in its finality. You did this, Mrs. Ashford. You destroyed your daughter's happiness, and you abused my trust, and you used your younger daughter as an instrument of your ambition. And you did it all from within the safety of a mother's love, which made it invisible to everyone, including me. The stillness that followed was the most complete Saren had ever known. It was the stillness of a held breath, of a world suspended between what was and what would be. Ottilie broke it. She turned to her mother, her face streaked with tears. Is it true? Cosima looked at her younger daughter, and for a moment, for one fleeting, unguarded moment, something real passed across her face, not remorse. Something closer to exhaustion, the weariness of a woman who has been running a long and complicated race and has just seen the finish line disappear. Everything I did, she said, her voice low and controlled, I did for this family. You did it for yourself, Saren said. It was the first time she had spoken. Every head turned to her. She was standing very still, her hands at her sides, her face wet with tears she had not bothered to hide. She was not performing anything. She was simply standing in the truth, bare and unadorned, and letting it be enough. You were afraid, Saren continued, her voice clear. You were afraid that if I married well, you would lose control. You were afraid that my happiness would diminish your authority. So you took it. You took his letters, and you took mine, and you wrote a lie in my hand, and you let me believe for 7 years that I was not worth remembering. She paused, and then you offered Ottilie in my place because Ottilie was younger and more pliable and more likely to keep you close to the center of power. Cosima said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The architecture of her deception lay in ruins around her. The Duke turned to Ottilie. His voice when he spoke to her was gentle. Miss Ottilie, I owe you an apology. I entered into our engagement in good faith, believing the circumstances of my separation from your sister to be genuine. They were not. I cannot in conscience continue an engagement that was built on a foundation of lies. Ottilie was weeping openly, her golden curls falling around her face. She looked at Saren, and in her eyes was not the accusation Saren had feared, but something far more painful. Recognition. The slow, terrible dawning of understanding that the sister who had served her tea and pinned her hair and borne every humiliation had been the rightful woman all along. You knew, Ottilie whispered. All this time you knew, and you said nothing. I had no proof, Saren said, and I could not hurt you without it. Lady Fairholme rose from her chair. She crossed to Ottilie and took her hand. Come with me, child. This room has had enough truth for one afternoon. Ottilie allowed herself to be led away, her sobs echoing in the corridor. Lady Fairholme paused at the door and looked back at the Duke and at Saren, and the faintest suggestion of approval crossed her ancient face. Then she was gone. The Duke looked at Cosima. A carriage will take you to the inn at Whitford this evening. My solicitors will be in contact regarding the forged documents. I would advise you to cooperate fully. Cosima stood. She was diminished but not destroyed. Her back was still straight. She looked at Saren with an expression that was, for the first time, entirely honest. It was not love. It was not remorse. It was the cold, clear-eyed acknowledgement of an opponent who had played well and lost. She left the room without another word. The door closed behind her with a soft final click. Saren and the Duke were alone. The fire crackled. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, catching the dust that drifted in the stillness. The wooden box sat open on the table, its contents exposed, the paper record of years stolen from them both. "I should have come back sooner," he said. His voice was stripped of its formality. It was the voice of a man standing in the wreckage of his own failures. "You could not have known," she said. "I should have questioned it. I received a letter that contradicted everything I knew about you, and I accepted it because it was easier than fighting for the truth." He looked at her, and his eyes held nothing back. "You fought, alone, with nothing, against a woman who held every advantage, and you never stopped." "I could not stop," she said simply. "If I stopped, the lie would have become permanent." He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his jaw. He reached into his coat and withdrew something small. He held it out to her. It was a ring. Simple, unadorned, a thin gold band set with a single dark stone. She recognized it. He had shown it to her once in the garden at Briarwood. It had been his grandmother's. "I have carried this since the day I left," he said. "I never gave it to Adelie. I could not, and I did not understand why until last night." Saren looked at the ring. She looked at the man holding it. The candles on the mantelpiece guttered in a draft from the window, sending shadows dancing across the walls of the room where her letters had been kept for years, read and reread and held against the absence. "I will not ask you today," he said, closing his fingers gently around the ring. "You have waited long enough for promises. You deserve time. You deserve choice. But I wanted you to know that it has always been yours, as I have always been yours." The door of the drawing room opened a crack. A small, dark head appeared. Gray eyes looked from one face to the other, reading the room with the acute, wordless perception of a child who has learned to survive by watching. Then Wren pushed the door fully open and padded across the carpet in her bare feet. She took Saren's hand in one of hers and the Duke's hand in the other, and she held them, a small, unyielding bridge between two people who had been kept apart for far too long. And standing there, in the late afternoon light of the west drawing room, bound together by the grip of a child who had chosen them both, Saren felt the weight of everything she had carried lift from her shoulders and scatter like ash in the wind. The autumn came to Keldmere like a slow exhale, the fierce greens of summer softening into amber and rust and the deep, burnished gold of turning leaves. The lake reflected skies of pale pewter, and the great house, for the first time in years, felt warm. Saren stood at the window of the library, a room she had claimed as her own in the weeks since the reckoning. It was smaller than the Duke's study, tucked into the south corner of the house where the light was best in the mornings, and it had become her sanctuary. Her father's books, recovered through the Duke's solicitors from the scattered buyers who had purchased them from Cosima's agents, were slowly filling the shelves. Not all of them had been found. Some were lost forever, but enough had returned to make the room feel like a conversation with a man. She still missed every day. She was not alone. Wren sat on the window seat beside her, legs tucked beneath her, absorbed in a book of illustrated birds that Saren had found in the village. The child had not spoken yet. The physician said she might not for a long time, or ever, that the shock of losing her father and the months of grief had buried her voice in a place that could not be reached by force. But she was present now, in a way she had not been before. She turned pages. She pointed at things she wanted Saren to see. She brought pebbles and feathers, and, once memorably, a very disgruntled hedgehog that she had carried in from the garden with an expression of solemn triumph. She was learning to trust, and the learning was slow, and Saren did not rush it. The household had changed profoundly. The departure of Cosima had been swift and undramatic. She had left in the carriage the Duke had provided, her trunk loaded by servants who would not meet her eyes, and she had not looked back at the house or at the daughter who stood in the doorway watching her go. Saren had felt many things in that moment: relief, grief, anger, and beneath them all, a stubborn, ineradicable sadness for the mother she had never had, the one who might have existed if ambition had not consumed everything else. Audley had stayed. This had surprised everyone, including Saren. After 3 days of tears and seclusion in her room, attended by the patient and unsentimental Lady Fairholme, the younger Ashford sister had emerged, red-eyed but resolute. She had come to Saren's room and stood in the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her, looking so young and so uncertain that Saren's heart had ached. "I did not know," Audley had said. "I swear to you I did not know." "I know you did not. Do you hate me?" "I have never hated you," Saren had said, and meant it. The relationship between the sisters was being rebuilt, carefully and honestly, without Cosima's shadow between them. Audley had taken rooms in the village at Lady Fairholme's suggestion, close enough to visit but far enough to begin building a life that was her own rather than a reflection of their mother's ambitions. She was discovering with some astonishment that she was a capable and resourceful young woman when not being directed like a piece on someone else's chessboard. The Duke's solicitors had been thorough. The forged documents were submitted to the appropriate authorities. Saren's inheritance from her father, modest but meaningful, was being recovered through the legal proceedings. Briarwood itself could not be reclaimed. It had been sold and resold, but the proceeds held in escrow would eventually come to her. She did not think about the money, she thought about the mornings. They had fallen into a pattern, she and the Duke. He rode out early, as he always had, but now when he returned, he came to the library. He brought coffee, and the morning's post, and the particular energy of a man who has been outdoors in the cold air, and is glad to be indoors again. They sat together and read, or talked, or simply occupied the same space in comfortable stillness, and Wren sat between them on the window seat, a small anchor holding both worlds steady. He had not asked her again. He had kept his word. He had given her time and choice, and the restraint of it, the discipline it required from a man who was not by nature patient, told her more about the depth of his feeling than any declaration could have. But the ring was always there. She had seen it once on his desk when he had left a drawer open. The thin gold band with its single dark stone, waiting, as she had waited, as he had waited, for the moment when waiting was no longer necessary. That moment came on a Tuesday, in the library, in the most ordinary way imaginable. Wren had found a bird in the garden, a young starling with a damaged wing. She had carried it inside, with the same solemn determination she applied to all her rescues, and presented it to Saren in cupped hands, her gray eyes blazing with the urgency of the mission. Saren had fashioned a splint from a twig and a strip of linen, working carefully while the Duke held the bird steady in his large, gentle hands, his fingers dwarfing the creature. The bird had pecked him. He had flinched, and Wren, watching, had made a sound. It was small and breathy and barely there, but it was unmistakable. She laughed. They both froze. Saren looked at the Duke. The Duke looked at Saren. Between them, Wren covered her mouth with her hand, as though the sound had surprised her as much as it had surprised them, and above her fingers, her gray eyes were wide with a new and unfamiliar emotion. Joy. Saren felt the tears come. She did not fight them. She let them fall, openly, without shame, in front of the man she loved and the child who had found her way back to the world through the patient, stubborn insistence of being seen. The Duke set the bird gently in the box they had prepared for it. He straightened. He looked at Saren with an expression that combined tenderness and resolve in equal measure. Then he did something he had never done before. He reached across the space between them and brushed the tears from her cheek with his thumb. "I said I would not ask again until you were ready," he said, his voice low. "But I find I cannot keep that promise any longer." "Then do not keep it," she said. He took her hands. They were not a servant's hands. They were not a duchess's hands. They were her hands, steady and certain, and finally, after everything, held by the right person. "Stay," he said, "not because you have nowhere else to go, not because of obligation or gratitude or the resolution of old wrongs. Stay, because this house is your home, because that child is ours." says, "I have loved you since the garden at Briarwood, and I have never stopped, not through the lies, not through the years of believing I had lost you." Wren, who had been watching this exchange with the intensity of a small, extremely invested spectator, reached into the pocket of her pinafore and produced something. She held it up between them. It was a pebble. Gray, and perfectly round, polished by water. The first one she had ever given Saren, the one Saren had carried in her pocket every day since. The child placed it solemnly on top of their joined hands. Saren looked at the pebble. She looked at Wren. She looked at the Duke, whose severe face was softened by a warmth that she had once believed she would never see again. "I have been ready," she said, "since the day you spoke my name." He smiled. It was not the restrained, careful tilting of the lips she had learned to read like a language. It was a full, unguarded, transforming smile, the first she had ever seen him wear, and it changed his face entirely. He did not kiss her then. That would come later, in the garden, in the last light of the autumn afternoon, with the great house glowing behind them and the sound of Wren's laughter, her second laugh, ringing across the water of the lake. For now they simply stood in the library, hands joined, the pebble balanced between them, the starling rustling in its box and the morning light falling through the window onto the spines of her father's recovered books. 3 people. One family found, not by grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but by the patient, unshakable refusal to stop believing that the truth, however long it takes, will always find its way home.